He lost 10 years of his life because of a lie told by a police officer. But when the truth was revealed, the entire courtroom was stunned, and the judge couldn't hold back their tears. Eric Harper, a kind-hearted father and a devoted husband with no prior criminal record, was suddenly yanked out of his car right in front of his home without any explanation. Before he could even comprehend what was happening, he was handcuffed, thrown into a police car, and falsely charged with armed robbery, a crime he had no connection to. His desperate pleas of innocence fell on deaf ears as the testimony of a renowned police officer in the force buried him in the darkness of prison for a decade. But Eric didn't give up. He fought in desperation, teaching himself law in prison and relentlessly submitting appeal after appeal. Meanwhile, a young prosecutor noticed inconsistencies in his case, and what she uncovered shook the entire justice system. When the truth came to light, the retrial became one of the most heart-stopping moments, and in the end, even the judge couldn't hold back their emotions after hearing what had happened to Eric. What truly happened on that fateful night? Why was an innocent man sentenced to 10 years of wrongful imprisonment? And when the truth was uncovered, who would be forced to face justice? Stay tuned until the end to witness every intense and emotional moment of this incredible story. If you love inspiring and meaningful stories like this, make sure to subscribe to the channel now so you won't miss the next captivating content. Thank you for always supporting Emotional Journey. As the peaceful sunset settled over the small town, painting the familiar road a golden hue, Eric Harper drove home after a long day at Joe's auto shop. The cool autumn air flowed in through the crack of his car window, carrying the scent of dry leaves and a faint trace of wood smoke from the homes in the neighborhood. It was the time of day he loved most, a moment when he could leave behind the stress, drive down the quiet road, and think about a warm dinner with his wife and daughter. The image of Alyssa bustling in the kitchen and Maya eagerly running to the door to throw her arms around him always made him smile. The radio played a soft tune, blending with the steady hum of the tires rolling on the pavement. Eric felt at ease, his mind relaxed as he turned onto the small street leading to his home. But before he could enjoy the tranquility any longer, a flashing light suddenly blared into his rearview mirror. Red and blue lights flickered on the car's glass, followed by the harsh sound of a siren cutting through the peaceful silence. Eric's heart skipped a beat. He frowned, looking into the rearview mirror. The patrol car right behind him signaled for him to pull over. A wave of confusion passed through him. He hadn't been speeding, his headlights were on, and his documents were all in order. There was no reason for him to be stopped. Still, Eric calmly slowed down and pulled over to the side of the road. As per protocol, he took a deep breath, gripping the steering wheel tightly as his mind tried to make sense of the situation. The police car door opened, and a tall man stepped out. Under the dim street light, Eric immediately recognized the face, Officer Richard Davis. Davis's reputation wasn't unfamiliar to the locals. He was the kind of officer who didn't need a reason to abuse his power, a man who could turn a minor issue into something serious just because he wanted to. Eric felt a subtle tension crawl up his spine, but he remained composed. Davis walked up to the car, his hand resting on the belt where his gun lay still in its holster. His face was expressionless, cold, and empty, a silent threat. "Driver's license and registration," Davis said, his voice blunt, slicing through the night air like a knife. Eric swallowed hard, trying to keep his voice calm as he reached for his wallet. "Yes, officer. Is there a problem?" he asked as he handed over his documents, scanning Davis's expression, looking for any clue about what was happening. But Davis didn't answer right away. He skimmed through Eric's papers indifferently. Then his gaze lingered on Eric, cold and empty, as if he had already made a conclusion in his mind. "Get out of the car," Davis suddenly said. His tone, not loud but heavy, sent a chill down Eric's spine. Eric blinked, surprised. "Is there a problem, officer?" Davis tilted his head, his sharp eyes challenging Eric to ask again. "I said get out of the car." Now, no explanation, no sign of what was going on, just the cold voice and the emotionless stare of someone holding all the power. A shiver ran down Eric's back as he realized that tonight wasn't going to end the way he had hoped. Eric's hands gripped the steering wheel as an uneasy feeling rose in his chest. He didn't understand what was happening, but it was clear that the officer in front of him had no intention of offering any explanation. A cold gust of wind swept through, rustling the leaves along the street. But in Eric's mind, everything seemed to fade away, leaving only the pounding of his own heartbeat. Davis suddenly pulled out his handcuffs and stepped up to the car door, his face devoid of emotion. "I'm telling you for the last time, get out of the car. Now." Eric swallowed hard, slowly opening the door and trying to appear cooperative. But the moment his foot hit the pavement, Davis lunged at him, wrenching his arms behind his back with brute force. The cold metal of the cuffs tightened around his wrists, sending a sharp pain shooting up his arm. "You're under arrest," Davis declared, his tone leaving no room for resistance. Eric was stunned, struggling to turn and look at the officer. "What for? What reason?" He tried to pull away but was slammed against the hood of the car. "Armed robbery," Davis replied coldly, as if the verdict had already been decided. Eric felt as though he had been struck by lightning. "No, that can't be. I never." Davis didn't let him finish. He yanked on Eric's arms, causing him to stumble and almost fall. Eric's breath came in shallow gasps as his head spun, trying to make sense of what was happening. But what hurt even more were the things happening around him. His neighbors, the ones he had helped, the ones he greeted every morning, were standing by the sidewalk, silently watching. Some avoided eye contact. Others stared in confusion. No one spoke. No one asked questions. No one intervened. A boy around 8 years old stood nearby, tugging at his mother's hand, whispering, "Mom, did Uncle Eric do something wrong?" The woman hurriedly pulled her child away, not answering. Eric wanted to scream, to demand that someone stand up and testify to his innocence, but he knew no one wanted to get involved. No one wanted to confront the police. "Please," he tried to stay calm, turning to Davis. "You've got the wrong guy. I didn't do anything." Davis just sneered and opened the patrol car door, shoving Eric inside. He fell into the back seat, his wrists still cuffed behind him, breathing heavily as the door slammed shut. Through the window, he saw Alyssa running out of the house, her face panicked. She screamed his name, rushing toward him, but was stopped by another officer. Maya stood on the doorstep, her eyes wide with confusion, watching as her father was taken away. "He's innocent. Please, he didn't do anything wrong." Alyssa cried, but her words only disappeared into the air. The patrol car pulled away, carrying an innocent man out of the life he had known. Inside the prison, the oppressive air enveloped Eric as the heavy steel door slammed shut behind him. Reality hit him like a crashing wave. He was no longer in front of his house, no longer a free man. A guard led him to the interrogation room, where the cold neon lights flickered over a scratched metal table. In front of him was a thick stack of files. Another officer sat down across from him, flipping through the documents, speaking in a calm tone as if this were just a routine procedure. "Eric Harper," the officer read aloud. "You've been charged with participating in an armed robbery last night at a jewelry store on 5th Avenue. A witness identified you. Your fingerprints were found on a weapon discovered near the crime scene." Eric felt his blood run cold. "This can't be. I've never been to that place. I don't even own a gun. Someone made a mistake." The officer just smirked and placed a photo of the crime scene on the table. "We have the evidence, Mr. Harper. The jury will find this more than enough." Eric shook his head repeatedly, the suffocating feeling overwhelming him. This couldn't be real. He had never touched a weapon, never even considered committing a crime. But everything, from the accusation to the forged evidence, was stacked against him. How could a peaceful life shatter so suddenly like this? Eric sat in the cold interrogation room, his hands tightly clasped together, as the door creaked open. A middle-aged man stepped in, carrying a thick stack of files in his hands. He looked weary, with messy graying hair and dark circles under his eyes, as though he hadn't slept a wink all night. This was Martin Reed, his appointed public defender. Reed sat down across from Eric, flipping through the pages of the file without so much as a glance at him. "Eric Harper?" he asked, his voice flat, devoid of any concern. "Yes, that's me," Eric replied, trying to maintain his composure. "I didn't commit the crime. I've never been to that jewelry store. I need you to help me prove that." Reed sighed, taking a sip from his cold coffee in a paper cup. "Look, Harper, I've got more than 20 cases waiting to be handled, and time is not on our side. I'll do what I can, but—" He shrugged as if to say this was almost a lost cause. A chill ran down Eric's spine. He knew he needed a lawyer who would truly fight for him. But looking at Reed's fatigued demeanor, he understood the man didn't have the time or the drive to do so. The first day of the trial took place in a formal but stifling courtroom. Eric sat at the defendant's table, trying to keep calm, but his palms were already sweating. When the prosecutor called Officer Richard Davis's name, an invisible tension filled the room. Davis stepped up to the witness stand with confidence, his icy eyes glaring as if he was already certain of his victory. He looked directly at the jury, his voice strong but laced with a false sincerity. "I chased Eric Harper right after the robbery occurred," Davis testified. "I saw him running from the scene, breathing heavily as though he just fled. When I apprehended him, he couldn't explain why he was near there." Eric clenched his fists. Davis was fabricating the story. Eric had never been near that jewelry store the night Davis was referring to. But from the way Davis spoke, Eric knew the jury was being convinced. The prosecutor continued, "Officer Davis, did you find any evidence linking the defendant to the crime?" Davis nodded, his voice firm. "Harper's fingerprints were found on the gun discarded near the crime scene." Eric felt his body freeze. That couldn't be true. He had never touched a weapon. Reed, who should have objected immediately, merely sighed, flipping through the file in front of him disinterestedly, and stood up. "Officer Davis, aside from the fingerprints, do you have any eyewitnesses who saw the defendant commit the robbery?" "Yes," Davis replied without hesitation. "A witness at the jewelry store confirmed Harper was there the night of the crime." A man was called to the witness stand. He looked nervous as he took his seat, glancing around the courtroom before meeting Davis's eyes. He swallowed hard and answered the prosecutor's question. "Are you sure that the defendant, Eric Harper, was the one you saw at the scene of the robbery?" the prosecutor asked. The witness hesitated, his hands clenched together. I think so. I didn't see clearly, but it looked like him." Eric gripped the edge of the table, his anger and despair rising. "It looked like him is not evidence." Reed finally spoke. "Are you sure?" The witness seemed unsure, his eyes briefly darting to Davis, as if seeking confirmation. I don't know for sure. I just saw a man running out, and the police showed up right away." Reed nodded. "So you can't say for certain that it was Eric Harper?" The witness opened his mouth to speak, but the prosecutor quickly interrupted. "We're not just relying on this testimony. We have forensic evidence, fingerprints on the weapon." Eric almost wanted to scream. "They've staged it all." The judge banged the gavel, calling for a recess. As Eric was escorted back to his cell, he felt the last remnants of hope within him fading. If things continued down this path, would anyone ever believe he was innocent? Or was this the end of his life? The courtroom was thick with tension. The air felt heavy, almost suffocating, as if the walls themselves were closing in on everyone present. Alyssa sat in the back row, her hands tightly clutching each other, as if the mere act of letting go could cause everything to unravel. Beside her, their daughter Maya sat stiffly, her wide eyes filled with a quiet, palpable fear. Her tiny hand was clasped firmly in her mother's, but every so often, Maya would glance up at the front of the room, where her father sat surrounded by officers. Eric Harper, the man Alyssa loved more than anything, the father Maya had always looked up to, sat there before them, his posture stoic yet filled with silent tension. He was trying to maintain his composure, but Alyssa could see the truth in his eyes, the pain, the confusion, the betrayal. He was holding it all in, but his eyes betrayed him, and the anguish was clear. Alyssa's heart shattered as she watched him, knowing there was nothing she could do to help. There was no action she could take to change this outcome. It felt as if time itself had slowed, and in that moment, all she could do was sit there, feeling utterly powerless, wishing she could be the one to bear this burden for him. Judge Eleanor Vance sat at the bench, her face stern and impartial as always. Her reputation for fairness and justice was well known, but even she couldn't hide the weight of what was about to unfold. Alyssa watched her, knowing the judge had no choice but to follow the law. But even so, in the pit of her stomach, Alyssa felt a deep, gnawing sense of dread. This was not justice. Has the jury reached a verdict? Judge Vance's voice rang out, calm but laden with gravitas. Her eyes swept over the room. A man from the jury stood, his face grim, holding a piece of paper that had already been signed. His movements were slow, deliberate, as if the very weight of what he was about to say was too much for him to bear. "Your Honor," We have reached a verdict. Alyssa's heart skipped a beat. Her hands gripped Maya even harder, and she could feel her daughter's tiny fingers trembling in hers. The room was silent, save for the pounding of her own heart. She felt her breath catch in her throat. Maya's eyes were wide, searching her mother's face, and Alyssa could see her daughter's confusion, the innocence of a child who couldn't understand why her father was being treated this way. Alyssa could barely find her voice, but she knew what was coming. The jury foreman cleared his throat and began to speak, but his words came slowly, almost painfully. On the charge of armed robbery, we find the defendant, Eric Harper, guilty. The words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Alyssa felt as though the ground had been ripped from beneath her feet. The world around her seemed to go still, as if time itself had frozen in that moment. A wave of shock hit her like a tidal wave, and her breath caught in her chest. Her heart was pounding painfully in her ears. She could feel her entire body trembling as she tried to process what had just been said. No, it can't be. This isn't happening, Alyssa whispered, her voice cracking. Tears flooded her eyes before she could stop them, and she instinctively reached out to hold Maya closer, as if trying to shield her from the devastating blow. Maya, her face a picture of confusion, looked up at her mother, her big eyes wide with tears. She couldn't comprehend what had just been said, but the sorrow in her mother's face told her everything. "Daddy," Maya whispered, her voice trembling with uncertainty and fear as she slowly began to cry. Eric, sitting there in the defendant's chair, closed his eyes tightly, as if to block out the world, the weight of the verdict crushing him from the inside. His body tensed, but he remained as still as he could. When he opened his eyes again, he turned his head slightly, and his gaze met Alyssa's and Maya's. His eyes were full of pain, regret, and sorrow, but also love for them. He mouthed the words, "I'm sorry." It was a silent apology, an apology that broke Alyssa's heart all over again. The gavel rang out in the silence, a sharp sound that seemed to echo through the room. Judge Vance's voice came again, though it was thick with the weight of her own emotions. Defendant Eric Harper, based on the evidence presented and the jury's verdict, I hereby sentence you to 10 years in prison. Alyssa couldn't contain it anymore. She let out a cry of anguish, her voice breaking as the weight of the sentence crushed her. She stood, her hands reaching for Eric as if trying to make some kind of connection, some kind of plea, but it was in vain. "He's innocent. Please, he didn't do this." Her voice cracked, but it was drowned out by the sound of the courtroom, the finality of the sentence. It was as if her words meant nothing in that moment. The room was already decided. Eric's fate had been sealed. The officers moved in, approaching Eric with cold efficiency. They pulled him from his seat, securing the handcuffs around his wrists. Eric didn't resist, but his face was strained with the effort of holding it all together. As they led him away, Eric glanced back at Alyssa and Maya one final time. His gaze locked with Alyssa's, and he mouthed the words again, "I love you. I love you, Maya. I'll never give up," he shouted, his voice full of determination, but it carried a deep, undeniable sorrow. The doors of the courtroom slammed shut behind him, sealing him away from the world and from his family. The sound echoed in Alyssa's ears, the final punctuation of a life changed forever. As the door closed, Alyssa collapsed back into her seat, holding Maya tightly. The tears flowed freely now, unstoppable, as if her entire world had come crashing down around her. She had lost him, not just physically, but in the eyes of the law, and it hurt more than she could ever explain. The heavy clang of the steel door slamming shut behind him echoed down the cold, dimly lit corridor of the prison. Eric Harper stood frozen in his orange prison jumpsuit, feeling as though his soul had been exposed, laid bare along with the warm clothes he now wore. The cold, vacant eyes of the other inmates followed him as he was escorted down the narrow hallway. Outside, the world continued to spin, but in here, the rules no longer belonged to society. They were determined by the strong. This prison was unlike anything Eric had ever known. The old concrete walls exhaled the stench of mildew. The air was thick with the odor of sweat, spoiled food, and something else, something far darker, a smell of violence that hung like a heavy fog, ready to erupt at any moment. The rusted, stacked bunk beds were tightly packed together, and the murmurs, the sinister laughs, reverberated in the air. Eric could feel the tension in the atmosphere, like a taut string that might snap at any second. The guard stood before a small, cramped cell, barely big enough for two. "This is your spot," he said, shoving Eric inside. Before Eric could react, a gruff voice called from the corner of the room. "You the new guy?" Eric turned. On the bottom bunk lay an older man, leaning back against the wall, his arms covered in tattoos and scars. His face was weathered, etched with the marks of time, but his eyes remained sharp, alert. "I'm Eric," he replied, trying to keep his voice steady. The man cracked a wry smile, one that wasn't exactly friendly but wasn't threatening either. "Name's Andrew. If you want to survive here, you'll need more than just a name." Eric sat down on the top bunk, the mattress feeling incredibly hard beneath him. He fell silent for a moment, staring down at Andrew. "I don't belong here." Andrew chuckled quietly, a dry sound. "No one here belongs in this place, kid. But that's not what matters. What matters is whether you can survive until tomorrow." A chill ran down Eric's spine. He knew deep down that he had no choice but to adapt. If he didn't, he would never have a chance to prove his innocence and return to his family. Hell had only just begun. Every morning in prison began the same way. The shrill sound of the alarm blaring from the loudspeakers, the heavy footsteps dragging across the cold concrete floor, and the tension that hung in the air like an invisible fog. It had been 3 months since Eric Harper was thrown into this hellhole, but with each passing day, his sense of hope was slowly eroded, replaced by a deep, gnawing despair. He had sent out a total of 4 appeals, each one carefully written, outlining the inconsistencies in the charges against him. But every time, the response was the same: rejected. The reasons varied, but the message was always the same. The system didn't care about the truth. Each night, Eric lay on the hard bed, staring up at the cracked ceiling above him. The long cracks stretched across the wall like a wound that would never heal. He thought of Alyssa, of Maya. Was his little girl sleeping soundly or crying herself to sleep? Missing her father? Had Alyssa given up the fight for him, worn out from the endless cycle of hope and disappointment? The thought crushed his heart. 10 years in prison wasn't just a punishment for him. It was a punishment for his family. One night, when the prison was swallowed by an eerie silence, Eric suddenly heard strange noises coming from outside his cell. The sound of hurried footsteps echoed down the hallway, followed by a sharp, blood-curdling scream. He jumped to his feet, gripping the bars of his cell, straining to see what was happening. In the dim light of the corridor, he saw 2 inmates holding another man down on the ground. One of them pulled out something sharp, a makeshift knife. Eric shivered. In a matter of seconds, it was over. The man lay motionless on the floor, blood spreading around him like a dark pool. No one came to help. No one cared. Another prisoner glanced over, then turned away, walking off as if nothing had happened, as if this was just another part of daily life. Eric's stomach twisted in disgust. This was not just a place to hold criminals. This was a different world, a world where there were no rules, no justice. If he wanted to survive, he would have to be stronger than this. If he wanted to go back to his family, he would have to fight. But how could he fight when the entire world had turned its back on him? He returned to his bed, but that night, sleep never came. For the first time, a part of him began to wonder if he would ever escape this place. The days in prison seemed endless, each one blending into the next, weighed down by the crushing monotony. But after that horrific night, the violence that shook the very core of this place, Eric Harper began to see everything differently. He realized that if he wanted to survive, if he wanted to fight for his freedom, he could no longer sit idly by, waiting for something to change. He had to do something. He had to find a way out of the darkness that had enveloped his life. One morning, during the mandatory work hours, while the other inmates were pushing food carts or scrubbing the floors, Eric made his way to the prison library. It was a small, cramped room, the shelves leaning precariously under the weight of forgotten books. Dust clung to everything, and the books were haphazardly stacked, some with torn covers, others with missing pages. But as his eyes scanned the spines of the books, a flicker of light caught his attention: law. He carefully pulled out a thick volume titled Appeals Process and the Rights of Prisoners. His fingers trembled as he opened the first page. This could be his way out. If no one would help him, he would have to help himself. "What are you doing?" A low, gruff voice interrupted from behind. Eric turned to find Andrew, his older cellmate, standing with his arms crossed, watching him with curiosity. "I'm trying to find a way out of here," Eric replied, his voice firm with determination. "I've sent so many appeals, but no one cares. I need to understand the law. I need to know how to fight this system." Andrew chuckled softly and pulled a chair over, sitting down beside Eric. "You know what you're up against, right? This system is built to crush people like you. No one cares about the truth." Eric looked straight into his eyes. "I don't care what the system is. I care about my wife, about my daughter. I need to find a way back to them." Andrew was silent for a moment before slowly nodding his head. "All right. If you're this determined, I'll help. But listen, Eric, reading the books is one thing. Understanding them and applying them is another. I've been here long enough to know that the law doesn't always stand on the side of the innocent." Eric clenched his fists. "I won't give up." Andrew laughed softly, patting him on the back. "Good. Because you're going to need a lot of patience." From that day on, Eric spent most of his time in the library. He read everything he could get his hands on, carefully taking notes on every law, every appeal process, every case of wrongful conviction he could find. The words on the pages slowly became the only weapon he had. Though the road ahead was still fraught with obstacles, for the first time in months, a flicker of hope began to shine in his heart. That afternoon, as Eric sat surrounded by the musty books in the prison library, buried in his study of the law, the sound of footsteps approached. A guard appeared at the door, holding a letter in his hand. "Harper, you've got mail." Eric's heart skipped a beat as he looked up. There in the guard's hand was an envelope with his name written on it. His pulse quickened, his breath caught when he saw the handwriting on the front. It was the handwriting of Alyssa, his wife, his lifeline. And beneath it, the small script of their daughter, Maya. His hands trembled as he reached for the letter. The moment he tore open the envelope, he felt a wave of hope mingled with the deep, painful ache of longing. He carefully unfolded the letter, and his eyes immediately found the familiar, messy handwriting of his little girl. "Daddy, I miss you so much. I believe you didn't do it. I know you're innocent." The words echoed in his mind, louder than anything else in the prison, and his chest tightened as he read them over and over again. It felt as if Maya's words wrapped around his heart, squeezing it tightly. He imagined her sitting at the small desk in her room, struggling to form each letter, her little hand trembling as she tried to write the message that she hoped would reach him. This innocent little girl, with so much love and belief in him, deserved so much more than the pain of not having her father by her side. A tear fell from Eric's eye as he read, but he forced himself to blink it away. He couldn't break now, not when Maya believed so strongly in him, not when Alyssa had been fighting alone without him for so long. Below Maya's letter was another from Alyssa. "Eric," it began, and Eric's breath caught again. "We are waiting for you. Every day, I wake up hoping today will be the day we find a way. I've been to so many lawyers, but no one will help without money. It feels like I'm walking this road alone, but I'm not giving up, Eric. We will find a way. You have to believe that. Please promise me you won't lose hope." Eric's hands shook as he held the letter to his chest, his eyes closed as he leaned against the library desk, the weight of her words sinking in. He could picture her so vividly, her tired eyes, the faint lines of exhaustion on her face from months of trying to keep the fight alive. He could imagine her sitting by the window late at night, the glow of the lamp casting soft shadows as she wrote those words, holding on to the thread of hope that their family would be reunited again. Maya, his little girl. How much longer would she have to endure this pain? How much longer would she wait for her father to come home? The thought of her growing up without him, of her feeling the sting of abandonment in her heart, pierced through him like a dagger. He couldn't bear the thought. He would not let that happen, not on his watch. His fingers clutched the letter tightly, the paper crinkling beneath his grip. He could feel the weight of the promise, the weight of his love for Alyssa and Maya, the weight of every sacrifice they had made. In this might, he stood up, his chest swelling with a newfound determination. This wasn't just about proving his innocence anymore. It was about protecting the family he loved, about making sure Maya never grew up without the father who loved her more than anything. Eric returned to the library with renewed energy. The books before him no longer seemed like a daunting collection of legal jargon. They were his lifeline. Every page he turned, every law he studied, felt like a small step towards his freedom. He wasn't just a prisoner anymore. He was a fighter, a man who would stop at nothing to get back to his family. He promised himself, no matter how hard the road ahead became, no matter how long it took, he would not stop fighting. For Alyssa, for Maya, for justice. The fire in his heart burned brighter than ever before. He had nothing left to lose except his family, and he would fight with everything he had to return to them. In her small but orderly office, Sarah Miller sat hunched over her desk, her eyes glued to the computer screen, scanning through the case files that lay sprawled before her. As a young and ambitious prosecutor, she had always believed that justice must be upheld absolutely. Yet, as she reviewed the case of Eric Harper, a creeping unease began to settle in her chest. Something about this case didn't sit right. From the reports in front of her, the case seemed to have been neatly wrapped up. A man charged with armed robbery, fingerprints found on the weapon, testimony from a reliable police officer, and a witness confirming his presence at the scene. It appeared to be a perfect case. But Sarah didn't trust perfect cases. Her experience had taught her that when everything seemed too easy, it was likely that someone had orchestrated it. She started by examining the file of Officer Richard Davis, the man who had arrested Eric Harper. Flipping through the pages, she discovered something suspicious. Davis had a long history of similar cases, with his testimony always being the key piece of evidence that led to a conviction. Sarah frowned and opened another file. It was a robbery case from 5 years ago, also investigated by Davis. His testimony had sent a man to prison, but there was something odd about it. There was no security camera footage of the suspect, only Davis's word and a single witness, just like in Eric's case. She continued her search through other cases. 3 cases in which the suspect's fingerprints were found on a weapon, but no one saw them actually holding the weapon at the scene. The only witnesses in these cases were individuals whose testimonies showed signs of coercion or inconsistency. The deeper she dug, the colder a chill ran down her spine. Richard Davis was not just any police officer. He was a master manipulator of the justice system, a wolf in sheep's clothing posing as a defender of justice. Sarah opened the file on Eric Harper again, this time focusing on the fingerprints found on the gun. Upon closer inspection, she noticed something odd. There were no fingerprints other than Eric's. Wait a minute. If this was the weapon used in the crime, why weren't there fingerprints from the actual robber? The person who wielded the gun and fired it should have left more fingerprints. But no, only Eric's prints were found, as if the gun had been placed there after the crime was committed. Her chest tightened. She had seen enough. Sarah Miller knew that she had uncovered a horrifying truth, and if she wanted to reopen this case, she would have to face a powerful adversary. But justice is justice. She couldn't turn a blind eye to this truth. The case of Eric Harper had to be reconsidered. Sarah Miller sat up straight, her back rigid with concentration as she combed through the case files scattered across her desk. The hum of the office felt distant to her. Her world had narrowed down to the documents in front of her. As a young, ambitious prosecutor, she had always been driven by a fierce commitment to justice, the kind that she believed should be absolute. But as she continued to review Eric Harper's case, an unsettling feeling gnawed at her, a feeling she couldn't shake. Something wasn't right. At first glance, the case seemed airtight. A man charged with armed robbery, fingerprints on the weapon, testimony from a trusted police officer, and a witness who had identified him at the scene. It looked like a textbook case, one where justice had been served. But Sarah was no stranger to the idea that things weren't always as they seemed. Her instincts told her that this case had been too perfectly constructed, too neatly wrapped up, and every fiber of her being screamed that there was something hidden beneath the surface, something that had been carefully covered up. She couldn't shake the feeling that the truth was being buried. Sarah's sharp mind refused to accept it. She knew that if this was truly the work of justice, it would stand up to scrutiny. And so, she began to investigate every small detail, starting with the key player in the case, Officer Richard Davis, the man who had arrested Eric Harper. As she dug deeper into Davis's history, Sarah's pulse quickened. It wasn't long before she uncovered a pattern. Davis had a disturbing track record of similar cases, all leading to convictions based on his testimony. His words were treated as gospel, and the evidence from his cases always seemed to hinge on his word alone. A sense of dread crawled up her spine. The more she looked, the more she found. The same exact pattern had appeared in past cases where Davis's testimony was the crucial element that led to a suspect's conviction. She found one case from 5 years ago where his testimony had been the only thing that sent an innocent man to prison. No security footage, no solid evidence. Just Davis's word and the words of a single witness. This was no coincidence. Sarah continued her investigation, flipping through more case files. 3 more cases surfaced where fingerprints had been found on the weapon, but no one had seen the suspects holding the weapon at the crime scene. In each case, the witnesses were either unreliable or had been coerced into giving their testimony. It was becoming clear Richard Davis was not just a police officer. He was a master manipulator, using his position to feed lies into the justice system, leading innocent men to be convicted based on nothing more than his word. Her stomach turned. Davis was a wolf in sheep's clothing, a man who had woven himself into the fabric of the system and used it to trap innocent people. The idea of him getting away with this for so long made Sarah's blood boil. But now, Sarah had something that could prove everything. The turning point came when she returned to Eric's case, this time focusing on the crucial piece of evidence, the fingerprints on the weapon. She'd already seen the reports. Eric's fingerprints were all over the gun, but there was something that didn't add up. As she reviewed the records, Sarah's eyes zeroed in on a detail that had been previously overlooked. The weapon had been recovered at the crime scene, and Eric's fingerprints were the only ones on it. No one else's prints. Not the real robbers. Wait a second. If Eric had been the one to use the weapon, why were there no fingerprints from the actual criminal? How could it be possible that there were no prints from the person who actually committed the crime? A man firing a weapon would leave multiple fingerprints. It didn't make sense. But Eric's prints, only his. Her mind raced. Something was very wrong. It was as though the weapon had been placed there after the fact, carefully planted to frame Eric. Her hands shook as she went over the evidence again. This was the missing piece. The realization hit her with full force. Eric Harper was innocent. The entire case against him had been a lie, orchestrated by a man who had manipulated the system for his own gain. Sarah stood up, her heart pounding in her chest. The evidence she had was irrefutable, and she knew exactly what she had to do. She quickly compiled all the documents, including the images from the surveillance footage, and began preparing her report for the court. As she looked over the case one last time, she felt the weight of the task ahead of her. This was the key. This evidence could set an innocent man free after almost a decade of wrongful imprisonment. She couldn't let it slip through her fingers. With the report in hand, Sarah left her office, her heart racing with determination. She knew this would not be an easy fight. She was about to shake the foundations of the justice system, to confront powerful people who would stop at nothing to keep their lies hidden. But justice demanded the truth, and Sarah would not let it be silenced. She stepped into the courtroom, the documents clutched tightly in her hands. The moment had come. She would present her evidence, demand that Eric's case be reopened, and she would not rest until the truth was exposed for all to see. This time, the truth would not be buried. The courtroom was packed, the air thick with tension, so dense that it felt as though you could slice through it. After nearly 10 years since being wrongfully convicted, Eric Harper finally had his chance to stand before the court and fight for his justice. He sat at the defendant's table, but this time, he was no longer hunched over in despair. Beside him was Sarah Miller, the determined prosecutor who had painstakingly gone through every detail, found the cracks in the case, and was resolute in bringing the truth to light. Across the room, Officer Richard Davis sat on the witness stand, his face as cold as ice, but his hands gripped the edge of the chair, a subtle sign of anxiety he was desperately trying to hide. Judge Eleanor Vance, the same judge who had sentenced Eric years ago, looked around the room. This time, she wasn't simply relying on the perfect evidence that had been carefully arranged before. This time, she wanted the truth. Sarah stood, her gaze unwavering as she faced Davis. With a calm, calculated step, she walked forward, holding a file that contained the evidence she had spent months gathering. "Officer Davis, do you remember this case?" she asked, her voice sharp, cutting through the tension in the room. Davis smirked, attempting to remain unfazed. "Of course. I arrested Eric Harper right after the robbery. I followed protocol. Nothing to discuss." Sarah nodded, but without a word, she placed a stack of photos on the evidence table. She turned to face the jury. "As you all know, the robbery at the jewelry store on 5th Avenue took place at 9:15 p.m. Officer Davis claims that he pursued and arrested Eric Harper immediately after, near the crime scene. She paused, then clicked a button, bringing up a surveillance video from a gas station 10 kilometers away. The screen flickered, and there, clearly visible, was Eric Harper pumping gas at the exact moment the robbery took place. A gasp rippled through the courtroom. Eric clenched his fists, his emotions rising as he saw the irrefutable alibi that proved his innocence. This was the moment he had been waiting for, his chance to show the world that he was not the criminal they had believed him to be. Sarah continued, her voice steady but filled with power. He cannot be in two places at once. Officer Davis, how do you explain this? Davis swallowed hard, his eyes darting nervously, but he kept his composure, trying to maintain control. Maybe the video was doctored, or maybe he has an accomplice. Sarah's lips curled into a cold smile. She had expected this. How convenient, she said, placing another stack of files on the table. Because I've looked into previous cases that you've investigated, Officer Davis. And I found 3 other cases where your testimony was the sole evidence. But when I dug deeper, I found signs of manipulation. The room fell deathly silent. Sarah turned back to face Davis, this time lowering her voice, but each word struck like a hammer. How many times have you staged evidence, Officer Davis? Davis opened his mouth to protest, but Judge Vance raised her hand, silencing the room. She stared at Davis, her eyes flashing with fury. Answer her, Officer Davis, she commanded, her voice cold and firm. For the first time throughout the trial, Davis looked genuinely panicked. He glanced around the room as though searching for an escape, but all he found was the judgmental gaze of every person in that courtroom. Finally, after a long, uncomfortable silence, Davis took a deep breath, his shoulders slumping as he bowed his head. I did what was necessary to close the case quickly. A collective gasp filled the courtroom. Sarah stepped closer. So, what you're saying is you fabricated evidence to convict an innocent man? Davis remained with his head lowered, his voice barely a whisper. I was just following protocol. Judge Vance slammed the gavel down hard, her voice booming across the room. I don't care what you thought you were doing, Officer Davis. You stole 10 years from an innocent man. Davis had no words left. He knew it was over. The truth was out, and he had no defense left. For the first time in nearly a decade, Eric Harper saw the light of justice. But this wasn't the end. This was just the beginning of his freedom. The atmosphere in the courtroom had become so heavy it was almost suffocating. After Officer Richard Davis's confession, no one could deny the truth. Eric Harper had been wrongfully convicted. At the elevated bench, Judge Eleanor Vance sat silently, her face tight with an expression of guilt, as though she were carrying the weight of an unredeemable sin. She had been the one to strike the gavel that sentenced Eric to 10 years in prison, believing she was delivering justice. But now, as the truth was laid bare, she realized the terrible mistake she had made. She inhaled deeply, but even her breath seemed shaky. She looked down at Eric Harper, this man who had lost nearly a decade of his life behind bars for a crime he never committed. Defendant Eric Harper, her voice quivered with emotion, but she maintained the authority of a judge. Please rise. Eric slowly stood. The courtroom fell into a silence so thick it was as if time itself had stopped, and all that could be heard was the rapid beating of hearts from those witnessing this moment. Judge Vance looked up at him, her eyes reflecting a deep pain, regret, and respect. She placed her hand on the file before her, pausing for a long moment before continuing. After reviewing all the new evidence, the testimony of Officer Davis, and the truth that has been revealed before this court, she took a trembling breath, her eyes reddened with tears. I declare you innocent. The courtroom erupted in a chorus of gasps, sobs, and resounding applause. Alyssa immediately broke into tears, wrapping her arms tightly around Maya. She couldn't believe that this day had finally come. The man she loved, the father of her daughter, was free. Eric couldn't speak. His throat was tight, his body frozen, as if he couldn't fully comprehend what he had just heard. You are to be released immediately, Judge Vance continued, but her voice had started to crack. She looked down at her hands, trying to steady herself, but finally, a tear silently fell onto the papers before her. She had once prided herself on her fairness and judgment, but today, she realized that justice doesn't always stand on the right side. She had been part of condemning an innocent man, tearing apart his family, stealing years from him, years that should have belonged to him. She looked up at Eric, her eyes filled with sorrow. "I am so sorry. I am truly sorry." Eric met her gaze, his heart swelling with a mixture of emotions. Anger, pain, but above all, relief. He took a deep breath and slowly nodded. "I lost 10 years of my life." His voice was low but filled with strength. "But if my story can help someone see the flaws in this system, if it can save another person from suffering this tragedy, then I won't let my pain be in vain." The courtroom stood in a thunderous applause. Cheers and cries filled the air, blending together in a celebration of justice. The guard removed Eric's handcuffs. For the first time in 10 years, he felt his hands truly free. He turned around to see Alyssa and Maya rushing toward him. He opened his arms wide, and they embraced him tightly, crying in each other's arms. "We're going home," Alyssa whispered through her happy tears. Eric closed his eyes, inhaling deeply. For the first time in 10 years, he could truly smell the scent of freedom. The fading light of the afternoon sun cast long shadows as the heavy iron gates of the prison slowly opened. A light breeze swept through, carrying with it the familiar scent of earth, asphalt, and something else, something unfamiliar to Eric Harper: freedom. He stepped forward slowly, his worn-out prison shoes touching the ground outside, the ground he hadn't felt beneath his feet for 10 long years. No more cold walls, no more bars to confine him. Yet, instead of relief, he felt an emptiness. The world beyond had continued on without him, and it felt like he had been left behind. Cars whizzed past, their designs completely foreign to him, while new buildings rose up like towering giants, mocking the old memories he held on to. Life didn't stop to wait for him, it carried on, but he no longer felt like he belonged in it. Standing just beyond the gate was Alyssa, waiting for him. And beside her was Maya, his little girl, now grown into a young woman. Eric barely recognized his daughter. Maya was taller, her face more mature. The innocence he once saw in her eyes had been replaced with a look that was distant, unfamiliar. She smiled, but it wasn't the carefree smile he remembered from so long ago. 10 years of absence had created a gap that nothing could fill immediately. Alyssa gave him a weak smile, her eyes filled with tears. She was no longer the woman he had left behind a decade ago. Her hair was streaked with gray, and the deep lines of exhaustion marked her face. Eric could see the weariness in her eyes, as if the weight of the world had rested on her shoulders for the past 10 years. He didn't know what to say. He wanted to hold them, to tell them that everything would be okay, but could he really promise that? Maya hesitated for a moment, then stepped forward and embraced him. "Dad?" she whispered, her voice trembling. Eric held his daughter tightly, feeling the warmth of her in his arms, a warmth he had lost for so many years. But even in that embrace, he could feel a subtle distance, as if he no longer belonged to their world. Alyssa stepped forward and wrapped her arms around both of them. They had waited for him for 10 years, but could he make up for all that had been lost? A gust of wind blew through, carrying with it a chill that reminded him that the world had changed, and he would have to change with it. If he didn't, he would be left behind again. Eric Harper had regained his freedom, but justice hadn't truly been served yet. Though he had walked out of prison, the wounds left by the justice system in his life were not easily healed. Sitting in the small apartment that Alyssa had fought so hard to maintain over the past 10 years, he realized that everything had changed, but the injustice still remained. During those long, desolate nights in prison, Eric had seen countless people in situations just like his. Men who were convicted simply because they were born in the wrong place, people who didn't have enough money to hire a good lawyer, people who had no one to fight for them. They hadn't just lost their freedom, they had lost their dignity, their families, their futures. He couldn't turn back time and reclaim the 10 years that had been stolen from him, but he could do something to ensure that others wouldn't suffer the same fate. 1 week after his release, Eric attended the first meeting of an organization dedicated to helping those wrongfully convicted. Standing among people who had also been crushed by the system, Eric felt a sense of belonging here, more than anywhere else. Sarah Miller, the prosecutor who had helped uncover the truth of his case, approached him. "I knew you'd come," she said, offering a smile. Eric nodded. "I can't turn my back on what's happened. We've overturned one case, but how many more people are still locked up unjustly? I can't stop here." Sarah looked at him for a long moment before nodding in agreement. Then let's fight together. Months later, Eric officially joined a criminal justice reform organization, where he began helping others who were appealing their wrongful convictions. He understood their pain, the helplessness of being trapped in a system that cared more about convictions than the truth. He met with lawyers, activists, and other former prisoners who were also fighting for justice. But more than anything, he became the voice for those who had never been heard. From a man abandoned by society, Eric Harper had become a champion of justice, and he knew that this fight had only just begun. That afternoon, in Judge Eleanor Vance's office, the air seemed to still. The sunlight filtered through the large window, casting a soft, golden hue over the room, but it did little to ease the tension that hung heavy between the two people sitting across from each other. Eric Harper had finally come face to face with the woman who had sentenced him 10 years ago. Eleanor Vance had once been a symbol of justice in the eyes of many, but today, she was simply a woman confronting the greatest shame of her career. She sat there, gripping a pen on the table, her eyes clouded with exhaustion and regret. She had thought about this meeting for months, but now, facing Eric, she realized no words could undo what had been done. "Eric," she began, but then faltered, her voice caught in her throat. Eric sat silently, observing the woman before him. He no longer felt the anger he once had. 10 years in prison had taught him that hatred didn't give back what was lost. Finally, Eleanor Vance took a deep breath. "I can't undo the years you've lost. I can't change the past. But I want you to know, I am truly sorry." She looked up at him, her eyes swollen with tears. "I was wrong to trust falsified evidence. I was wrong not to ask more questions. And for that mistake, I've destroyed the life of an innocent man." The room fell silent. Eric looked at her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "You were wrong, and I paid the price with 10 years of my life." Eleanor Vance bowed her head, her hands clenched tightly on the table, as if awaiting a verdict of her own. But then Eric spoke again, his voice deep but powerful. "But I forgive you." She looked up, her eyes wide with surprise. You forgive me." Eric gave a faint smile, a smile tinged with both sorrow and understanding. "Forgiveness isn't for others. I forgive, not because you deserve it, but because I deserve to be free." A tear slid down Judge Vance's cheek. She had never felt smaller than she did in that moment. Eric stood, taking a deep breath. The weight in his heart was finally lifted. He turned to leave, leaving behind Eleanor Vance sitting there, the woman who once held the power of life and death in her hands, now only a person trying to come to terms with her own conscience. 1 year after his release, Eric Harper walked through the gates of the prison that had once held him. But this time, he was not walking in as a prisoner, but as someone helping to free the innocent.